All right, so in this chapter, we're going to look at the history of the death penalty in the United States. So the death penalty was considered a necessity in colonial America. There were no prisons in the colonies and very few holding facilities for those accused of crimes. Punishments were limited to banishment, fines, corporal punishment, and death. Now, if offenders were too dangerous, there was no viable punishment alternative to the gallows. The death penalty was not practiced as regularly as one might think, considering there were no prisons. It didn't make sense to use the death penalty regularly because labor was a sparse commodity, and we needed prisoners in order to develop the colonies. Now, the first documented execution on American soil takes place in 1608, and it was a British person executed. The British executed a spy for the Spanish. So let's look at the pre-Furman era, which we refer to as our modern era in the death penalty. So looking at the 17th and 18th centuries, Puritans bring the death penalty to America from England during the 17th century. They're seeking refuge for religious freedom, but they don't extend that same freedom to others who follow in their footsteps. Now, the Quakers arrive in Mass Bay Colony in 1656. 4 of their missionaries were executed by the Puritans shortly thereafter for refusing to leave. Now, this does little to deter the Quakers. The Quakers consider themselves prophets and martyrs, and they're driven to spread their message. Now, capital punishment starts to gain widespread support in the 17th and 18th century colonial America, because they came from England, where the death penalty was commonplace. The average colony had the death penalty for at least a dozen crimes, things that were pretty obvious like murder and treason, but also robbery, rape, arson, theft, counterfeiting, burglary, adultery, and being an unruly male child. Now, we know that religion plays a key role in the death penalty and in punishment, but it also plays a key role in the day-to-day life of colonists. Many of the crimes for which one could be executed were those that threatened religious order. So things like witchcraft, idolatry, blasphemy, and adultery. Now, the actual execution day is very carefully planned, and it's quite ceremonial in nature. So there's a procession to the gallows, and the route to the gallows was public knowledge so people could witness it. The condemned might wear a special robe. The death warrant was read out loud. There was a sermon and religious hymns, and a chance for the condemned to utter their final words. Now, when we think about deterrence, we want to remember there's 2 types of deterrence, specific and general. Specific deterrence assumes the effect of punishment on the future behavior of the individual being punished, whereas general deterrence is looking at the effect of punishment on those who witness punishment but do not experience it personally. So in order for an execution to actually deter, it needs to be visible and well advertised. So I want you to think about what that means for how we handle the death penalty today, and we'll come back to that in future chapters. Now, this visibility is achieved by holding it in public view. Now, the body of the deceased was often left on display, often with a sign around its neck indicating the offenses they committed. Bodies would be set close to roadways so they could be displayed longer, and authorities might go to great lengths to preserve the body from the elements so it could be displayed longer. So if you look at this picture to the left, these are gibbet irons, and they would be used to encase the body so that it could be displayed for a longer period of time. Now, in terms of retribution, this is our innate desire to get even. Okay. Now, William Penn, who settles Pennsylvania and lives from 1644 to 1718, seeks out, wants to reform these harsh punishments of the colonies. And he drafts a legal code called the Great Law in 1682, and it remains in place until his death. It limited capital punishment to the crimes of murder and treason. It made prisoners eligible for bail. Those who were wrongly imprisoned could recover double damages. Prisons were to provide free food and lodging. So prior to this, inmates were responsible for their own food and lodging. And all counties were to provide houses of detention to replace the pillory and stocks. Now, this was limited to the Quaker colonies, and as I mentioned, the day after Penn died, English code was restored. Now, also remember that Beccaria is seeking reforms at the end of the 18th century. He wants to abolish the death penalty, and he talks about the need for punishment to be certain, swift, and severe. And Jefferson was an avid supporter of Beccaria. So we'll be able to see his influence and how the early U.S. government develops. Now, in the 19th century, we have our first movement towards abolition of the death penalty. It's widely accepted that the death penalty should be severely restricted or outlawed. Maine crafts a law that requires every capital offender to spend 1 full year in prison before being considered for execution. At that point, the governor then could order an execution. We also see some other ways in which people are restricting use of the death penalty. We see this through jury nullification and executive clemency. Jury nullification is the right of a jury to nullify the law. You could be sitting on a jury, the defendant can be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury can still choose to acquit them. They can choose to ignore the law. So this is, a way to sort of get around what you think might be unfair prosecution by the state. So states sought to remedy this by coming up with degrees of crimes, mostly murder, so that juries could convict a defendant for the same crime at a lesser degree and thus avoid imposing the death penalty. Now, executive clemency refers to the power of the executive. So when we're talking about a federal law today, we're talking about the president, and in states, we're talking about the governor. It's their power to commute death sentences. This was very common, and it led to corruption in favor of those who were very well connected. For example, some slaves were granted clemency so they could be returned to their owners who were wealthy and had some influence with the governor. We also see vigilante justice developing, and we see this with lynching, and it's used primarily in the South, and it's primarily whites lynching blacks for a variety of crimes. 3,959 lynchings occurred between 1877 and 1950, with most of those occurring in Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Now executions begin to move out of the public eye. The events were considered nuisances. People were drunk and unruly while attending them, and they began to centralize them at the state level with just a few guests to witness them. In the 1830s, they're first removed in New York, removed from the public. And in 1834, Pennsylvania moves them indoors. The last public execution took place in Galena, Missouri in 1937, and 500 spectators paid to witness the event. And some went home with pieces of the rope that was used. And this is a picture of the rope that was used for this hanging over here on the right side of your PowerPoint slide. We then start to see people experimenting with the idea of using electricity. Edison invents direct current, and Westinghouse invents alternating current. Okay, now these two are competing with each other, and Edison begins staging demonstrations that his competitor was very dangerous. And he did so by electrocuting animals during highly publicized events using Westinghouse's alternating current. Now he uses his influence to convince the state to use Westinghouse generators when they decide that they're going to use electricity to execute offenders. Now, the first man executed within the electric chair is William Kemmler, and that occurs in 1890. And Westinghouse hires attorneys to fight on Kemmler's behalf. Because remember, Westinghouse doesn't want his type of electricity associated with this. Jefferson testifies that death by electrocution would be quick and painless if used with alternating current. The event, however, is far from quick or painless. Death by electrocution is soon considered the humane method of execution. And the idea here is that we want execution to be quick, painless, and reliable. Otherwise, we are not considered civilized. Now, changing the method of execution has major implications for deterrence. Remember, general deterrence says we need to witness punishment for it to be a deterrence. So it's interesting that people support methods. It's interesting that support turn to methods that obscure this process, even though this is supposed to be a deterrent. Now, pre-Furman ruling in the 20th century, World War I sees renewed interest in support for the death penalty. People are growing discontent with foreigners, and they fear an impending crime wave resulting from the Great Depression. In the 50s, we see some discontent with the death penalties, and abolishment starts to really gain some support in the 60s as a result of declining crime rates and the civil rights movement. In 1966, it's the only time in the Gallup poll the public opposition to the death penalty is greater than public support for the death penalty. Now, in 1976, Zimrig, Eigen, and O'Malley studied 204 Philadelphia homicide cases in 1970. 65% of defendants whose victims were white were sentenced to life without parole or the death penalty, and this happened only in 25% of cases in which the victim was black. Now, our first big modern case dealing with the death penalty is Furman v. Georgia in 1972. And it consolidates 3 capital cases, all of which were asserting that the death penalty violated the 8th and 14th Amendments. They're arguing that the imposition of the death penalty at sentencing was capricious and arbitrary, and it disproportionately impacts minorities and the poor. Now, this ruling basically held that the death penalty, as currently carried out in 1972, violates the 8th Amendment. This sets the stage for what's called super due process. Because death is final and irreversible, we need to treat it differently, and it requires states to develop higher standards when imposing the ultimate sanction. Now, the 8th Amendment requires individual consideration of both the offense and the offenders when we make a determination about whether or not to sentence somebody to death. Now, we know mandatory death sentences are unconstitutional. You can't say that if you commit crime X, you automatically get the death penalty. The Government Accounting Office in 1990 found that in 82% of cases, the race of the victim influenced the death penalty decision. So we know that defendants with white victims are much more likely to receive the death penalty. And the GAO also concluded that there's a pattern of evidence indicating racial disparities in the charging, sentencing, and imposition of the death penalty after Furman. And that wraps up this chapter.